what if everything you know, like your life, the world, even the stars, wasn't real? It sounds crazy like science fiction, but some really smart people think we might be living in a simulation. If you like thinking about stuff like that, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's dive in. So we're talking about a question that's both super old and like incredibly futuristic. Are we living in a simulation?
Yeah, it's a question that's fascinated people forever, philosophers, scientists for centuries, long before we could even imagine actually creating simulations.
It's pretty wild to think about. So where do we even start with something this big?
I think we got to understand the philosophical roots of this idea. Like the concept of a computer simulation is pretty new, but the idea that we might not be perceiving reality accurately, that's been around for a long time.
Okay, so let's go way back then. Who were some of the early thinkers who thought about this stuff?
Well, one of the most important was René Descartes, a philosopher back in the 17th century. He was all about radical skepticism.
Radical skepticism.
Yeah, he was famous for something called Cartesian doubt. It's also known as hyperbolic doubt.
Hyperbolic doubt. Okay, that sounds intense. What is that?
So basically, Descartes questioned everything. He was like, how do we know we're not dreaming right now? How do we know some powerful demon isn't messing with our senses, tricking us into believing things that aren't true?
So he was trying to strip everything away to find like a core of certainty.
Exactly. He was looking for something he couldn't doubt, and he came up with that famous line, I think, therefore I am.
Okay, and how does this connect to us living in a simulation?
Well, Descartes' focus on doubting our senses, it's super relevant to the simulation idea. I mean, if our senses can be fooled by a dream, couldn't they be fooled by a really advanced simulation?
I see what you mean. It's like he was setting the stage for questioning reality itself way before computers. Are there other philosophers who got us closer to the simulation idea?
Absolutely. We can't talk about this without bringing up Plato and his Allegory of the Cave.
Oh yeah, I kind of remember that from college. Shadows on the wall, right? Remind me how that fits in.
Okay, so Plato describes these prisoners chained up in a cave. They can't turn their heads. All they see is shadows on the wall, made by things passing in front of a fire. And they think the shadows are reality.
Right, right. So the shadows are like our limited view of reality.
Exactly. Plato's point was our senses can deceive us. What we think is real might just be a messed up version of a deeper, truer reality. Does that sound familiar?
Definitely echoes Descartes' ideas about doubting our senses. And I can see how it sets up the simulation argument. Like if those prisoners can be fooled by shadows, maybe we're being fooled by something way more sophisticated.
That's it. And that brings us to a more recent philosopher named Nick Bostrom and his simulation argument.
I've heard of him. What was his main argument?
So Bostrom, he's a philosopher at Oxford, and in 2003 he presented this trilemma. He said at least one of these things has to be true. Either civilizations that can run these kinds of simulations just don't exist, or they exist but choose not to make them for whatever reason, or we're almost definitely living in a simulation right now.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot to process. So he's saying that if it's possible to create these simulations, it's statistically likely we're in one.
Yeah, that's the heart of his argument.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes us face the possibility that our reality isn't what we think it is.
So we've got these big thinkers, Descartes and Plato, making us question reality. Then Bostrom comes along and says, hey, if it's possible, it's probably happening.
And that takes us to the next big question. Is it actually scientifically possible to create a simulation that's this real? Like, can we even imagine the technology that would take?
And that's a question we'll get into right after this. Just kidding, we're jumping right in.
All right, so let's get into the science behind this whole simulation idea. Could we, even theoretically build a simulation that's as good as reality?
It sounds like something out of a movie, but yeah, let's look at it seriously. What does science say about making a universe-sized simulation?
Well, first off, our current tech isn't even close. Our most powerful computers have trouble accurately modeling things like the weather, let alone an entire universe with all its details.
Makes sense. We're talking about simulating trillions of stars, planets, galaxies, and then all the life and the tiny particles. It's like an insane amount of data.
Exactly. The power you'd need to simulate a universe down to the quantum level is just way beyond us right now. But let's say for a minute there's a civilization way more advanced than us. Could they, with their crazy tech, overcome these limits?
Okay, so we've got unimaginable computing power now. What other scientific problems might there be?
That's where things get even more interesting, because even with super advanced tech, there are fundamental limits from physics itself. And one of the biggest challenges comes from quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics, that's the one that always kind of breaks my brain. How does that affect simulating a universe?
Well, quantum mechanics basically says there's a built-in randomness and uncertainty to reality. At the smallest level, particles don't always act in a predictable way. You can talk about probabilities, but you can't say for sure what'll happen every time.
So you're saying even if we had a computer powerful enough to crunch all that data, there's still a level of unpredictability we can't get around.
Exactly. It's called the physical predictability constraint. Even a super advanced civilization couldn't perfectly simulate a universe with quantum mechanics because they couldn't predict everything perfectly down to the smallest level.
Wow, that's fascinating. So even with godlike computers, there's a limit to how accurate our simulation could be. Makes you wonder if those simulated beings would even notice the glitches, the weird stuff from those quantum uncertainties.
You're thinking like a simulator already. That's a great question. But it gets even trickier. There's another constraint called the computational predictability constraint, and it throws another wrench in the works.
Okay, computational predictability constraint, what's that all about?
Think about this. What if you tried to simulate not just the universe, but also the computer that's running the simulation? You'd be trying to simulate a simulator that's part of the very universe it's simulating.
Whoa, that's getting really meta. Sounds like a paradox.
Right. It's like an infinite loop that's impossible for computers to handle. It means you can't really separate the computer from the universe it's simulating.
Okay, so we've got the randomness of quantum mechanics and this mind-bending problem of simulating the simulator itself. Seems like the science is stacking up against us. But there's one big thing we haven't talked about yet, consciousness. Even if we could get past all these computer problems, how could we simulate something as complex as consciousness?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it takes us to a place where science hits its limits.
All right, let's go there. How do scientists view the idea of simulating something as intangible as consciousness?
Well, the first problem is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
We don't really know what it is, how it comes from physical stuff, or even how to define it so we could copy it.
It's not like we can just write code for awareness or experience,
Right.
right? Consciousness is something deeper that we haven't figured out yet.
Right. And even if we made AI that acts like it's conscious, like it can learn, solve problems, and even have emotions, it doesn't mean we've actually created subjective experience. We might be faking the outside signs without the real thing.
So even if something passes the Turing test and acts like a conscious being, we can't be sure it's actually experiencing the world like we do.
Exactly. And that brings up another layer, the meta problem of consciousness.
The meta problem. Okay, I'm curious. What's that?
The meta problem asks, why is consciousness a problem for us at all? Why does it seem so mysterious? Why can't we just explain it as something that comes from complex systems like our brains?
So it's not just about figuring out what consciousness I is S, but also WHY. It's so hard to understand.
Precisely. It makes us look at our own ideas about reality and the connection between mind and matter.
Definitely a head spinner. Feels like every time we try to wrap our heads around the simulation idea, we just uncover more complexity. But before we get too lost in the philosophy, I want to talk about another cool area of science that's relevant: quantum physics. We talk about how it limits how predictable a simulation could be, but could it also be the key to actually making a simulation?
Great question, and it leads to one of the most interesting poles of this whole thing. Quantum computers, they use quantum mechanics to do calculations, and they could be like insanely more powerful than regular computers.
So if we're talking about simulating a universe down to the quantum level, it seems like quantum computers would be essential.
Totally. And remember how we talked about the inherent uncertainty of quantum mechanics? Well, that's built into how quantum computers work. They use things like superposition and entanglement to do calculations in a way that's totally different from normal computers.
So quantum physics is both a problem and a possible solution to simulating a universe.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if the weirdness of quantum mechanics is a sign we're in a simulated reality.
Okay, my brain is officially fried. But even if it's theoretically possible to make a universe this complex, it still feels like a huge leap to say we're actually in one. Is there any evidence that points to us being simulated beings?
That's where it gets really speculative. There's no proof, no smoking gun, but there are some interesting things in physics and cosmology that some people say might be hints.
Interesting things. Like what?
For example, there's the fine-tuning problem in cosmology. It's the idea that the fundamental constants of physics seem incredibly fine-tuned for life to exist. Some people think maybe our universe is like a carefully calibrated simulation.
So instead of a cosmic coincidence, our universe's settings were chosen to make life happen. That's a wild thought.
It is, and there are other ideas too, like the holographic principle, which says our 3D reality might be encoded on a 2D surface like a hologram. Stuff like that has fueled a lot of the speculation about the nature of reality.
Seems like the more we learn about the universe, the more questions we have. It's exciting and a little scary. But even if we can't prove or disprove the simulation idea, it's definitely captured our imaginations and made us think about reality, technology, and consciousness.
Totally agree. And it's not just academics talking about this. The simulation hypothesis is everywhere in pop culture, movies, books, video games, you name it.
Which is a perfect segue to our next topic, the cultural impact of the simulation hypothesis. From the Matrix to video games, this idea has definitely seeped into our collective minds. And that's something we'll explore right after this. Just kidding.
Oh.
We're diving right in.
Oh.
Okay, so we've talked about where the simulation idea comes from, like the philosophy and the science.
Yeah, we've gone from ancient ideas about how our senses can be tricked to the possibility of future tech that could change how we see reality.
And now let's look at how this idea has shown up in our culture. Like, how has the simulation hypothesis become part of our stories and entertainment?
Well, the biggest example has got to be The Matrix. That movie took the simulation idea and made it into this visual and philosophical thing. It really brought the concept of simulated reality to everyone.
Yeah, The Matrix definitely blew my mind, that whole red pill, blue pill choice. It really showed how our reality could be a total illusion.
Exactly. The Matrix played on a deep fear that we're not really in control, that we're just part of some bigger game we don't understand.
And it's not just movies, right? This idea is everywhere. Like video games where you can build and control worlds, and books that explore what it means to have a simulated consciousness.
Totally. Games like The Sims and Minecraft, they let you kind of be the simulator. You get to create a whole virtual world. And authors like Philip K. Dick and Ted Chiang, they've written some really thought-provoking stories about simulated reality and AI.
It's wild how this idea has gone from being a fringe philosophy thing to a major theme in our entertainment. It's like we're practicing for the day we find out we're in a simulation.
Maybe. Or maybe it's how we deal with our worries about technology. As we spend more time on computers and in virtual worlds, the line between real and fake gets blurrier.
It definitely raises some big questions about how we relate to technology,
Yeah.
but there's also the ethics of it all. If simulated consciousness is possible, that opens up a whole bunch of ethical problems.
You're right. Creating conscious beings inside a simulation that has huge ethical implications. If these beings can feel emotions, have relationships, and maybe even suffer, do we owe them certain rights and protections?
It's like the debate about AI. If we create something that seems conscious, whether it's physical or virtual, how do we make sure it's treated well? What are our responsibilities as creators?
And it gets even more complicated if you think about nested simulations, like simulations within simulations. If we're in a simulation, maybe there are other simulated beings in our world making their own simulations.
Whoa, okay, that's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Like endless layers of simulated realities, each with their own ethical questions. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around.
I know it's a rabbit hole that can lead to some serious existential questions. But even if we never know for sure, the fact that we're asking these questions makes us think about ethics in a new way.
It makes us think about what it really means to be conscious, to be alive, and to have a sense of right and wrong. It's a tough but important conversation.
And I think that's one of the most important things about the simulation hypothesis. It's not just about figuring out if we're in a computer program. It's about making us think deeper about reality, the limits of what we know, and our place in everything.
It reminds us that even in a world that's all about technology, those big questions about existence, consciousness, and purpose, they still matter. Maybe they matter more than ever.
So as we wrap up our look at the simulation hypothesis, we're left with more questions than answers.
But maybe that's okay. Maybe the real point of this whole thought experiment is the journey itself, like exploring ideas that make us question everything and learn more about the universe and ourselves.
If this has made you curious, if it's made you question your reality, then we've done our job. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep looking for those bits of truth hidden in plain sight.
And if you enjoyed this mind-bending trip, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with your friends who love to think about these things. Until next time, stay curious.